Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Lit Happens. Today is a solo one with myself, Belle, going to be taking you through the English Studies elective module on the road. So, what I just want to do today is cover what that rubric looks like, in particular with the new syllabus. I mean, all you English Studies teachers out there will know that this has been a popular elective from previous prescriptions. But I thought we'd just take a little bit of a dive through the specific outcomes, the new outcomes, and the specific content and responding points that are relevant here. Also, we might look at some text ideas. I'm going to throw some out there that I know I have used and I know of other exceptional English studies teachers have used as well, and just some discussion on content and activities as well. So I know that normally we tend to focus more on the advanced and standard cohort. So hopefully all you English studies teachers out there can have just a bit of a listen, just to give you some different ideas if you're looking at how to vary up what you are teaching. So the first thing we kind of want to look at today, or that I want to talk to you guys about today, is the actual module, what the rubric is, and what ideas are represented here. So if you look at the English Studies syllabus, you'll know that they've got 5 different outcomes. You'll know that the electives for the English Studies course can be taught in year 11 or 12. So obviously, depending on where you decide to put that in your scope and sequence, that's going to influence whether you're doing the year 11 outcomes or the equivalent year 12 outcomes. Now, the lovely thing about this rubric now for On the Road, it's only a small paragraph or two. It is something that you can show your studies students, or you could do a bit of a dot point or an abridged version or a visual version for them, because all you English studies teachers out there know this course requires a lot of scaffolding, a lot of support, a lot of chunking of certain information. And also, as teachers, you need to be very selective about the way that you're presenting information and what you're giving based on the cohort that you have. And we know that every English studies class is different. I've definitely had some that were all at that kind of lower level, which made it in some regard a bit easier to pitch to that. I've also had classes where some are doing the exam and some are not. So maybe the way to think about it is kind of tiered approaches. A simplified, like you've got an idea or an activity for On the Road, you've got your simplified version. You might have your middle of the range activity, and you might have your activity that's really going to prep the students that are keen to sit that final exam. So I've digressed a little bit, but basically it is important you make that decision where it's going so that you've got the correct outcomes. And then we know that after our beautiful little rubric blurb, we've also got some 4 understanding content points and 4 responding content points. And I'm going to cover that with you guys a little bit now. So the first thing that I often tell my students when I'm teaching them this On the Road elective is this idea we're looking at how texts through this idea of travel can represent different experiences and perspectives on the world. So we'd obviously have our physical elements of travel, but we're also engaging here the more emotional, intellectual, spiritual aspects of travel. And so what we're really looking at is then how text, i.e. literature, can help represent this diversity of travel experience. So to students, I might just say, texts are not just going to show us what specific or physical travel is taking place, but they're going to represent the different ways that we can see the world through travel. I would also say to my students, we're looking at whose perspective of travel is shown, perhaps whose perspective is missing. We might also look at with travel, are there cultural aspects being represented on travel? What are the kind of emotional and spiritual experiences we might have with travel? And then how they might impact and frame who we are, and the lesson to be learned, or the growth that enrichment that comes. This is also a really good opportunity to showcase culture. If you're trying to embed that in this particular unit, you might let that guide you in terms of where the travel takes place and what is understood through that travel journey. So, we are going to be looking at different places and maybe cultures and trying to teach individuals about that. But I think very much so we want to emphasize to our students that idea of the impact of travel, how it helps us see the world, experience the world, and how it enriches us. So, another thing that you might consider as well is this idea that texts are acting as a bit of a window into maybe an unfamiliar world or an unfamiliar life or unfamiliar experiences. So, in that regard, we can look at travel texts that might educate us uh, into these unfamiliar worlds. We might also look at maybe misrepresentations of certain worlds. Obviously, that will be dependent on your cohort. Um, and so, what we might think about then with this module is the way that language is being used to showcase this idea of travel in order to represent something that we can learn or understand or have a renewed attitude or an assumption about. So, the analyzing language is going to matter here because, it's going to represent in this rubric what is being revealed about perspectives and attitudes. Um, so I guess here some things that you might do to engage those aspects of the rubric with students. You might be looking at cultural issues. You might be looking at cultural differences, even global or social issues. Looking at even empathy or awareness for new environments, and just reiterating to your students that this module is really about becoming more aware of the world beyond your own experience here. And so when you are looking at travel with your students, you might be encouraging them to kind of analyze, perhaps even evaluate the effects that journeying can have on an individual and on the lives of people and groups and societies. So what they might look at here is the journey positive? Is it negative? Is there complexity here? Um, and so, not just looking at where they're going or what they're doing, but maybe why and how they are doing it, I think really helps develop a bit of a deeper analysis here of the journey that you are exploring. So, when we're looking at these outcomes, what they're really calling for is for students to be able to look at information and ideas and how they're represented in the variety of texts, look at how the author of that travel text is shaping meaning and influencing audiences through language. Also, maybe even identifying connections between the texts. So you might be selecting a couple of very different travel texts and having students make that comparison um, for similarities or differences. And also, it's really about them being able to communicate their own ideas and perspectives about travel, through their work, and through their writing. So when well, let's actually maybe move on then. I think I've covered a fair bit in terms of the rubric here. I think the thing is just to remember that we're going to be needing to guide them. So getting down to the concept of travel, doing some brainstorms with them, using a lot of visuals to activate some background knowledge will be really helpful here. Being really explicit with what travel experiences you're showing them and being very deliberate about what kind of realizations or understandings do you hope your students will come to about travel and journeying and exploration. And once you've kind of worked out what those options are, you might backward map from that then and think about what texts and ideas might help you engage with those aspects of the rubric here. So, the last kind of thing to note for this particular module rubric is that it's about the ways that the mode and medium can influence language and structure. And I'm going to talk about the content points further, but I think this is a good unit where you could do a few different text types in a few different forms. And then that way, that will really allow students to have a bit of a comparison of the way that the changing form or structure or language can actually reshape or offer a new understanding of the idea of travel. I might get into now then the next part, which is the actual syllabus outcomes and content points for this particular module. Just bear with me because I am relying on my own tech skills. as opposed to the extraordinaire tech man Adriel. So, okay, looking at these outcomes, when we're translating it for our students, we're going to be covering and getting students to look at how they can understand and interpret ideas about travel and or culture, perspective, values. We're going to get them to be able to analyze how texts are shaping these meanings about travel. We're going to help students make connections between the differing representations of travel. We're also, going to support our students in communicating these ideas of travel clearly, using proper terminology and using some evidence. And that will also come into the fact that they'll need to kind of create their own text, both kind of creative and analytical. And this might be something that you do formatively across the weeks. And perhaps you select a sample or their best analytical piece and their best creative piece and could potentially use that for assessment. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But in this particular rubric, when you're looking at it, we've got our understanding points of the ways language, forms, and features are used to communicate ideas, the explicit and implicit meaning in text, the ways mode and medium can influence language and structure, the ways that audience, purpose, and context shape meaning in a variety of social, community, and workplace texts. So, when you're looking at the rubric, it refers to this idea of a range of literary and other texts that represent experiences of travel. This could include advertising, journalism, filmmaking. You might look at the language of blogs, reviews, travel ads, and documentaries here. You might also look at, governmental advice, informative and factual text to do with travel. I think the range of text here is really going to allow you to hit all those understanding points within your syllabus here. So what you want to be thinking about when you're doing your scope and sequence and you've got your plan of your weekly lessons is to make sure that kind of per week you're hitting at least one or two of those dot points. Perhaps in the first half of the unit when you're still in the content and the understanding phase. And then in the latter half of the unit, you're going to shift to the responding phase, right? And that's where we've got these 4 points. We've got composes a variety of texts that use language forms and features to present particular attitudes, values, and perspectives. Composes critical texts that use appropriate evidence to support a clear point of view. Use complex sentences to communicate the relationship between ideas in a range of texts. Use appropriate textual forms and structures to communicate information and ideas. Now, teachers who might have already taught on the road in the previous prescriptions and syllabus might be noting that there's a bit more specificity now with these understanding and responding dot points, which is really great because you could map them out in your actual 8, 9, 10 week program and then go in and embed specific text and then go in and embed specific activities to hit all those content points. So in that regard, it's quite directive and explicit. But what I know that you will have noticed as well as I have, what I really like about these understanding and responding points is they are very studies appropriate. They are quite generic. If you compare these with the standard course even, you'll see that these ones are much broader and just more about getting students to consider how language is represented. And then this will give you a nice through point to be able to either keep the activities as straightforward and structured and scaffolded as they need to be, but also allow that flexibility if you do have some students that you need to extend in that studies course. So when we're looking at that responding section here of the outcomes and content, it's saying that they should be able to compose a variety of texts, which means that we want to be showcasing a variety of texts as a bit of a model for them and something that they can springboard off of and write. And note that it also talks about presenting particular attitudes, values, and perspectives. So that gives you that guidance where when you are looking at your text for this module, you need to zone in on those attitudes and values and perspectives. And, likely you will have a range of texts that will have an array of these attitudes, values, and perspectives. And that will be really nice for your students too, because it's going to give them a broader scope for when they get to choose what they're responding to. There's also that caveat that they need to compose a critical text with evidence, so potentially, complete analytical or essay responses might be really difficult with your particular studies cohort. I might in that regard just look at maybe body paragraph writing, even just creating a body paragraph um, first time on a text as a whole class, and then giving them that scaffold and kind of workshopping with them so that they can kind of produce one their own. Obviously, a lot of joint construction will work really nicely here. Sentence starters, samples, scaffolding, your support in the room. But yeah, I think that the way that it's worded here, there is an opportunity for students to engage in a few different ways and for teachers to be able to differentiate. So that's quite nice. And then, as we often do, there's that part of the syllabus that is all about expression and communication of ideas. That's left quite nice and broad as well. So you can actually steer this on the road module in a way that best suits your class. And I found when I have taught it, probably covered it 3 different times across 2 different schools. Um, it does shift and change depending on the cohort that I have. Sometimes I might get a lot more creative and showcase a lot of different texts. In some particular classes, though, I've had to limit to about maybe 2 to 4 texts and text types and just really take that a week or 2 at a time before I've sort of moved on there. Ultimately, though, the last thing I want to say about the outcomes and content is obviously what you're going to do here text and content wise, sorry, is dependent on the text that you're going to be choosing. So and not only is it dependent on that, but the text that you choose is going to be a reflection of the assessment task that you're going to be creating for them. So whether that is a bit of an analytical response on the representation of on the road and journeying and travel, it could be something a bit more multimodal where they perhaps create a travel vlog or something like that. Perhaps you actually get them to create a suite of text. Perhaps they have to create an itinerary, which would cover your informative text. And then, maybe they actually have to create a couple of blogs as well in that kind of memoir style. And then maybe they have to create a review of a certain place. And that in that review, they can, they're hitting that analytical and critical, but they can also cover the perspectives and the renewed understanding. So there's a lot of ways in with this unit, again, depending on what you're doing holistically. Across your whole assessment schedule for studies, but just a few options there. All right, guys, so I might just cover now some text types and text ideas, core texts for this, because obviously we have our prescribed text for the equivalent to the common modules in the other English courses. But with this one, you do get some choice. There are some caveats with they've got to, you've got to have something that's representing Indigenous perspectives. You've got to have something that's representing culture. You've got to have something that's a meaningful and rich literary text. So depending on how you play that jigsaw here, these are some texts that I have used and also some texts that I know of wonderful colleagues that have used very effectively with their own studies classes. So one particular text type that you might like to incorporate is film. In the past, when I taught on the road, we would also teach text and human experience and with the film Billy Elliot, which was fabulous for English studies. I'm actually really sad it's gone. It's brilliant. I had an all boys studies class and they just really engaged beautifully with the film. So that's a shame, but I digress. back to the text. because we had the on the back of the on the road module, that film text. We had done the film text of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty with the students as well as a bit of a core text. We did do other text types along the way, but this was kind of our core because we use this as the opportunity to do some film analysis, to create some body paragraphs, and then to create a little bit of a critical response, because we knew that we were then going into an essay for Billy Elliot for the common module for those studies kids. So that's one example of film. I know that some other texts that are really popular, Into the Wild is a great film text, and there are also documentaries that people have chosen to showcase as well as part of a core text. I think a film and documentary works really well here if you've got, a film or film text, or like in some of those other um, prescribed text modules. So you might also find that film and documentary might work really well for a particular cohort that you have. Maybe their kind of strugglers a bit with chunks of text, and so that might be the avenue that you go through. Um, the other text type is obviously fictional text. There's no reason why you can't do fictional text here. Obviously, you'll be doing more fictional text in your common modules, but even short stories here work really nicely in that similar vein. You could do the short story of The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, particularly if you have students who are keen to sit exam and do all those things. So they might be actually engaging with that. You might actually select chapters from a text, or a certain passage or two that you think really emphasizes a particular perspective, idea, or attitude that you would really like to show your students about travel. Similarly, you might look at poetry. I think poetry is really nice as a way to uh, introduce even the idea of travel, because you can find short, sharp, and sweet poems. So, The Road Not Taken is a really powerful one, particularly where you're trying to elevate your students beyond the physical aspect of travel and trying to get them to consider the way that travel has an effect on our sense of self and on our psyche and on the life that we're going to lead. So when you're trying to take them through those deeper understandings of travel, The Road Not Taken might work here. Even I Wandered as Lonely as a Cloud comes to mind. So there are a lot here. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm going to have a visual text, I'm going to have a short written text, and maybe something that's more like article based here. So, a variety always works. Um, when it comes to nonfiction text here, you can look at travel blogs. There are some big name travel people out there who have very well done websites with very well documented journeys of their travel. That might be a way that you're engaging the multimodal kind of component of our syllabus here. And that kind of lends itself to vlogs too. Um, Again, there are some really popular ones out there, obviously with, your teacher discretion and guidance. It might be a nice kind of flipped learning activity where, you tell the students when they head home to go on one of their social media accounts and just have a look at anybody who might be posting any videos about travel and kind of what they sort of covered and reflected and what story they told through that video. And that just might be a nice way to discuss and get some engagement from your students as well. So travel blogs and vlogs are really wonderful. I particularly love travel blogs because often you can find some that are just about a page, which is really lovely for your studies kids. And you could print them, you could annotate them, you could use them as a model for students to practice their own travel blog as a reflection of somewhere they've traveled. This is in similar vein with articles on to do with tourism, particularly with impacts of tourism. From memory, I know a few years ago, I looked at this article in terms of the impact that tourism has on like the environment and on societies who really rely on tourism for their growth and economy, and sort of, what happens when that gets dismantled a little bit. So that's potential here. There's very much an option here to look at social issues with your students through the lens of travel. And also a nice nonfiction text is memoir as well. There are a lot of travel books and travel writing pieces that you could find, again, where you could just take an excerpt out of and, have a look at that with your students. On top of that, you might also have some multimodal text that you're looking at. I'm thinking about like your smart traveler sites. I know I have used that personally when I've traveled abroad. You might be able to get your students to consider some travel apps and the way that they are representing and collating information. Also, having a look at interactive travel sites. Lonely Planet might offer some sections of their website where there is that interactive component, and that will give you an opportunity to talk about how that new technological form and structure is impacting what students are understanding about travel. And lastly, we would have, everyday kind of social text. So tourism ads can be something, even, advertisements that we'd see on free to air TV that go for 30 minutes to an and 30, I was going to say 30 minutes, 30 seconds to a minute are really nice. I often like to show the Australian ad campaigns, the ones that they advertise abroad. The Qantas ad with the Australian children's choir is really beautiful and impactful in terms of its imagery. Even the one millennials will remember, the Where the Bloody Hell Are Ya ad with Lara Bingle, who I think possibly was Miss Australia at one stage. So there's a lot that can be done there. Then you can have a really nice discussion about representation of our own culture, and perhaps what is being represented and what is not being represented. Where is there a gap or a silence? And, perhaps even looking at stereotypes of our culture through travel, and how, we might be using that to draw others closer and vice versa. Um, the airline campaigns, I just mentioned Qantas, that would be a good one too. And even looking at government travel warnings. So there are lots of brochures. Quarantine ads might be something that you might consider looking at with your students as well. I really love this module because the world's your oyster in an essence here, because you could go various routes and you're still going to have a really enriching unit for your students. And the last thing I might just mention when you're looking at these different texts is how you might position the text for these students. So you might do a bit of a comparison between these romanticized or stereotyped travel ads versus your real or confronting travel articles and representations, so that way students can also look at text not being just about showing or seeing a place, but travel really being about shaping how we feel about those places and how we feel about ourselves. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of room here where you can simplify it or extend it for your students as necessary. All right, guys. Last thing I just want to talk for about 5 more minutes is the content and activities that you could be engaging with for your lessons. So, um, what we want to think about here is that the lessons and the activities are going to be obviously dependent on your text types and what text you've chosen, but also thinking about what activities can you structure throughout your term that's going to support your students with whatever they're going to need to do for their assessment task. So I think that backward mapping is first and foremost the most important thing. Now, in terms of activities and ideas, these could be classroom activities, formative activities. Perhaps you might use some for a summative assessment as well. So you could look at travel blogs, ask your students to create their own travel blogs. You might actually ask students to transform a traveler's travel blog where you change the point of view of the article. Perhaps you might move it from a romanticized to a real, or vice versa. For example, you'd be looking at perspective and bias here, where the blog maybe was from the perspective of a tourist, and now you rewrite that from the perspective of the resident, depending on their own thoughts, feelings of that experience. So, advertisement deconstruction is a big one. Teaching your students how to do that, a bit like you would do a scene analysis if you were doing a film text, getting them to look at how um, imagery, sound, text are being used multimodally and in combination to represent message. Similarly, you might have your students create their own travel ad, either print, visual, even video form. That could be about some place that they've traveled to, or perhaps a place that they have researched they would like to travel to. That would be really good to get them to consider representation, and also looking at authorial intent and the impact on audience here. Even doing some activities around documentary reflection. There are some really good even TV series out there. If you've got access to ClickView, you can find, I think it's called The Most Dangerous Places in the World. And I'm pretty sure it's GPG, like it's a very, safe thing to be showing in your classroom, and they'll offer a perspective or an experience in a certain environment. And so that might be really nice too, because you can look at what cultural insights are being presented here, perhaps what assumptions are being challenged, perhaps what stereotypes might be reinforced. There's some room there. Creative writing here might be really lovely too. So, even having students create a narrative on an unexpected journey, or turn a location that they factually researched where they would like to go into a narrative of a character experiencing that place for the first time. Is that way, not only are you going to allow them to represent, culture, but they might also be looking at a personal discovery here. That might actually also be engaging them to play around with voice and their creativity here, and also being allowing them to look at emotional representations in text as well. Um, I think I think the beauty of this module is there are so many fun activities that students can be doing that they won't even realize they're learning as part of their rubric, or that it really highlights key aspects of their outcomes and content points for this module. And I think that's why I really love this elective. I think it's elective C on the road, because it's one of those units where you have so much fun throughout the teaching and learning of it. Goes nice and quick. You have less issues in your classroom. Everyone's more engaged, and it really can be a fun and creative assessment task as well. You could pitch them an idea where they've got $5,000 or $10,000, and they've got to organize an itinerary and research where they'd stay and what they'd eat and what attractions they'd visit and why. And then they could do a personal reflection of, experiencing that vicariously through the research. So there's so much room here. I really love this elective. Be really interested to hear what studies teachers are doing with it now, if they've been able to keep a lot of the great things that they were doing, or whether they've had to make some shifts and changes to it based on the new additions to the English Studies revised syllabus. So I'd love to hear comments, email us, share this around. We'd really appreciate the support. If you're watching on here, I hope you could see me fine. Again, I didn't have Adriel, my tech whiz, so I'm praying that it filmed correctly and you can hear me well. And as always, we just really thank you guys for listening into our episodes. We really love recording them, and talking about the beauty of what we're teaching, and what can be achieved through English. So thank you everyone for this short episode, and we'll be back in your ears next week. Bye.